Welcome to the Organizational Transformation Kung Fu Podcast with your hosts, Sandy Varecchia and Jennifer Long.
All right, welcome to another episode of Organizational Transformation Kung Fu, where Jen Long and I get together on a fairly regular cadence and talk about all things leadership. We love the name of Organizational Kung Fu, or OT Kung Fu for short, because it reminds us on the daily that leadership is a practice, and we need to always be thinking about things as a continuum. And it takes patience, much like Kung Fu does, in order to learn the art of it. And so when people come to us with their leadership problems and issues, we help them work through them, but not in a real quick motion. We want to make sure that something takes root when we're helping our organizations, or all organizations should be looking at organizational change in the respect that it takes a bit of time to get it. So welcome, Jen.
Hello, Sandy. It's so nice to see you.
Me too. So Jen's company is Own Up from Denver, Colorado, and she is the author of a brand new, fairly new book called Own Up, all about accountability. So if you haven't read it, please pick it up. My company is Satori Consulting in Toronto, Canada, and we, as I say, we love to do our podcasts. So today, Jen did a podcast with Todd Conklin, who is has a book called The 5 Principles of Human Performance, and he works with organizational health and safety. I was unfortunately not able to participate because I am part of the sandwich generation, and I had parent duty that day. So Jen took one for the team and had a terrific conversation with Todd.
I did. We missed you.
Well, what we thought we would do today is, because in his book, The 5 Principles of Human Performance, he has 5 principles. And we thought we would preface the actual conversation with Todd by walking through these principles and explaining them, because they are simple in their form, I think, but powerful if leaders can really absorb them. And you remember that Todd is coming from a health and safety perspective, but this certainly holds true in all of our organizations, no matter what business they're in. Would you say, Jen?
Well, yeah. And Todd, even though he is heading up what we call doing safety differently, he meets with leadership in organizations all the time, and he meets them at their worst, right? When they've had some sort of serious accident, usually someone's died or something's happened on that level. And so he does a lot of consulting and work with the leadership. And so the whole point of our conversation was kind of to dive in on the HOP principles and how that relates from a leadership mindset, because in working with him and learning these HOP principles, HOP, it's been an interesting conversation to get leaders around this kind of thinking, because it's really, right, how you think about it is how you show up in it. And these principles, which are kind of an irrefutable kind of understanding about human performance in an organization, helps to frame up how you see your leadership aspect. And so he was very interesting. So I'm excited for everyone to hear that. But for people who don't know what the HOP principles are, there are 5 of them, right? Which is obviously the 5 principles of his book, which is a very quick read. The first principle is error is normal, right? People make mistakes. And coming to that realization that if you're expecting people to operate with 100% effectiveness 100% of the time, that you're setting up yourself in a very kind of what he calls a brittle system, that you're undoubtedly, your expectations will not be met. Undoubtedly, you will be disappointed, because we are human and we are error prone. And so embrace that and lead with an eye toward that, which is why we talk about building capacity.
Yeah. And I think in terms of safety, I'm remembering there was something that happened a couple of years ago that was catastrophic. And I remember when they unpacked it after, and I'm not an expert in this area by any stretch, but I remember hearing that there was a blame mentality on what in that area with oil and gas, I think. And there was a blame mentality. And had they not had that, likelihood of this happening, because people tend to try to cover up right? Because I
Right.
don't want to be the one, I don't want to be blamed for something. So I'm not going to bring something forward just because. And so it's in the context of safety, a really critical aspect. But in all organizations, I don't know how many leadership teams, as much as they talk about, to fail and fail fast and things like that, they still don't want anybody to have errors. And so,
Right. They don't have a healthy attitude towards
no,
failure, right?
no,
And when they get failure, yeah, Todd has this saying about you can either blame, shame, and retrain, or you can learn and grow. You can't do both.
yeah, yeah. Blame, shame, retrain. Probably not the best.
But that's generally what happens.
Yeah, yeah. So there is a human tendency, I think, to cover things up when if you have a culture of that. And so I think from a leadership perspective is really stepping back and looking to say what kind of culture do you have around errors and blame and things like that
Right,
for
right.
sure.
Because principle
Yeah,
number 2 is
blame fixes nothing.
blame fixes nothing.
Yes.
And that to me is such a great principle to live by. Why
Hmm.
you spend any time looking for that level of answer
Hmm.
doesn't serve your organization. It doesn't serve your workforce, right? It only answers the emotional male.
Yeah, it totally does. And so I was thinking about my morning this morning, Jen, when blame fixes nothing, and my husband knocked over my Buddha and chopped off its head. And I really blamed him for that. And I probably need to apologize because
That's right.
that's just a bad omen when you decapitate your Buddha. But it
Yes.
doesn't. It doesn't, right? And I find in some organizations that the blame culture is so. I'm working with an organization now where they have a strong blame culture, and what they do is they end run things. So if somebody does something wrong, they don't go to that person and say, "Hey, what happened? Why?" They go to their manager, and the manager goes to their manager, and it's toxic.
Yeah.
It just
It's
creates
toxic
this
and exhausting,
toxicity.
right? No
Yeah,
safety, no psychological safety.
none, none.
Yeah.
And so what do? They either, don't say it, right? Or
Yeah.
they run
Hide.
around pointing the fingers at everybody. And it's not good. So again, stepping back, what kind of culture do you have around blame?
Right. Because the culture is the next piece, right? So the third
Mm-hmm.
principle being context drives behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got a culture of blaming, right, that's context.
Yeah.
And it's going to drive behavior. No one feels safe. And so, because when nobody feels safe, we all behave in a way that's not productive,
Mm-hmm.
not proactive, hiding things, right? And the context piece is an interesting one because it works on so many levels, right? It's what's your organizational context?
Mm-hmm.
How does your structure, how do your processes generate the behaviors you're getting? Because strategically, if you're thinking about your processes and systems, they're currently set up to give you exactly the behaviors you're getting. So when you start to look at culture shift, looking not just at behavior change, looking at processes and systems that are also driving the behaviors you don't want, and how are you setting them up to give you the behaviors you do want? And so
Mm-hmm.
that's when you look at a change process, when you look at leadership, right? In a client that's focused on leadership behavior, but has yet to really make the adaptation around processes and systems that drive the behavior, right? Uh, to reset how they're structured to get that stuff.
And I think about this notion of context drives behavior from another angle as well. Is when we communicate the context of the why, right? People will their behavior will adapt to it because they'll know why they have to do it and what the end result needs to be. But oftentimes we don't provide enough context. It's just more of a do it mentality. So yes, processes and systems, but also from a communication standpoint.
Well, right. So when I teach accountability, my whole drivers of performance and choice points framework is an analysis of context to say when you've got somebody underperforming, what is the context under which they're making the decisions that don't work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And understanding that context helps you approach the conversation with much more acuity in terms of dealing with what you need to deal with. And So the context goes all the way down to the personal level
Yep.
of how am I operating? What do I, what skills and behaviors do I have? What's my attitude about something and how am I approaching the work? Because my context matters as much as the organizational context.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes. So that's the third principle. The fourth principle is learning and improving are vital.
Yes.
And that seems like a dumb thing to say out loud, but
Yeah.
it's it's people don't think about, when you talk about shame, blame, retrain, right? Retraining is not learning and improving. Learning and improving is space, right? To reflect, to adapt, and to accept failure as an opportunity, right? As opposed to hide the failure.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it also talks to organizations do so many things well, right? And so are we
Hmm.
looking at those things as well as the things that maybe we're not doing so well? So are we spending all our time on the improving the negative, or are we trying to improve on things that we're doing well and bringing us up to another higher level? And so
Right.
are we spending enough time in both areas, right? Celebrating what we're doing well.
Right. I think when you struggle to turn an organization around and when you're looking for how do we innovate, right, and do things differently, um, is to really understand what it is you actually do well. What is your core capability and how are you building on that as opposed to just eliminating the things that aren't working or that create, it's there's more power in understanding where you do excel and what your core is and how you can build on that, because there's more momentum there
Yeah.
than moving away from something, right, moving toward.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what a wonderful message going down through the organization when leaders are focusing their time and attention on things that are going well and getting
Hmm.
better, creating more
Hmm.
capacity at that level than sort of always being at that negative side.
Well, and I think learning is part of the capacity building,
Yeah,
right?
it
The
is.
more I know, the more confidence I have. And Todd
Mm-hmm,
talks about this in our session where we talk about confidence and capacity and what that's about. And to me, that just was such a beautiful moment. And so I'll let you listen to that when we switch over.
mm-hmm.
But yeah, that being able to, coaching creates capacity in people, learning and development creates capacity,
Yeah.
and it gives you more optionality. People can think better on their feet, they become better problem solvers and more resourceful, and it's that increased resourcefulness that is capacity. And
Mm-hmm.
we had sort of a pregame on this and we talked about why this is so hard for leaders to embrace and live in, because learning is hard to measure,
Yep,
right?
that's right.
And capacity is hard to measure.
Yes. Yeah, and in our little precursor, we were talking about, what Todd says is that you can't measure capacity, but you can monitor it. And in a world of KPIs and trying to figure out, what those hard measures are, this is something that everybody's talking about, but it seems really nebulous. It's sort of out there. And do we spend our time building capacity if we can't measure it?
Hmm.
Or are
And how
we,
do we know?
yeah. I think the other thing that he said that I thought was two things. He said that the best leaders are the best learners, and again, showing, walking the talk, and that leadership should be inspiring. And when you're an inspiring leader, that you create confidence in the
Hmm.
organization, throughout the organization. And again, his principles are not, if the opposite, the negative side of the principles, that's not an inspiring leader, right? Yeah,
Right. Yeah. Maybe it's always
yeah,
prove it to me. And that brings us to the last one, right? Which
yeah,
is how leaders respond matters.
yeah.
And that is distinctly important. And as you know, we obviously deal with leaders, coach leaders. This is always about the leaders. And the idea of how they respond, especially when there's error, when
Mm-hmm.
mistakes are made, when balls are dropped, when miscommunication, when things go at risk, right? A leader's response is critical because it sets the tone for everything else. Um, and that response is either going to lead to shame and blame and retrain, or that response is going to lead to learning and capacity building and growth and understanding. And how you answer that emotional mail when you're uh, under pressure, right?
Faced with it. Yeah.
That is the criticalness of every leader's job. And leading in good times, yay you, but leading in tough times is where you really earn it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we talk about a lot during our podcast is that whole self-reflection. You can't take something back, right? And so
Right.
how you respond matters. But if you happen to find yourself in that zone that was, not exactly the healthiest way of responding, it's how you regroup on that as well and be vulnerable and say you're sorry. But self-reflection becomes really important on how you on sort of, I guess, how you regroup on it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I think the most important thing. So 5
Exactly.
principles.
Right. Five
Error is
principles.
normal.
Error is normal.
Blame fixes nothing. Context drives
Context drives
behavior.
behavior.
Learning and improving are vital, and how leaders respond matters. So simple principles, but unpacking them, they hold a lot of weight.
And
So
how you use these to build capacity
yeah.
and create confidence. And so, with that, we will uh, let you listen to Todd Conklin, the master of the ceremonies of this episode of Organizational Transformation Kung Fu. Leave your comments at the end. Thanks for tuning in. How are you, Mr. Todd Conklin? It's so excited to see you again
I'm
in a
good.
digital
I'm
box.
good. I know it's so much fun to see you too. One of my favorite people in the whole world.
Yay. Yay. I am curious to talk to you about, so I have spent 6 months doing a leadership development program for one of my clients.
Perfect.
And um I also spent some time with them introducing them to the HOP principles.
How'd it go?
It was good, but I did it in a leadership context. And so
Yeah, yeah,
this
yeah.
is this is the because you are constantly talking to leadership in all the organizations that you work with. And so I just kind of wanted to have a chat with you to talk about this idea about building capacity and this idea about how leaders, right? What is the leadership role in the
Hmm.
capacity thing, and really applying the principles in a change management format, in an
Hmm.
innovation format, and
Hmm.
in a leadership mindset. Because that was immediately what I glommed onto when I heard I was like, oh, these work in so many different ways. And
Hmm.
so because you have those conversations, I was kind of curious to talk to you about how you turn their heads inside out in the right way
So
to
I,
get them
I,
thinking differently.
I think you're right. I mean, I completely agree with you. There's two things that I would start this conversation by saying. The first one is the realization that improvement is a deliberate effort.
Yeah.
Oftentimes takes leadership teams quite surprisingly, which I find interesting,
Yes.
not because I'm smart. I don't think that's the problem at all, but because I think they think they're going to accidentally get better. And
Yeah.
and I think they think if we do all our work, we will just accidentally get better. And so when you help them understand that improvement is a deliberate effort, that you're defaulting towards improvement, anytime
Hmm.
you're left with a decision, always make the decision that makes you smarter, better, right? Which seems, when you say it out loud, it's just super obvious. But I think that's a huge foundational piece. And then the second foundational piece, which totally fits your question, is I'm pretty convinced, and I'd really like to hear your feedback on this. I'm pretty convinced the only two things leaders actually manage, aside from administrative budget, stuff like that. I mean, let's put that aside for now.
Yeah.
The actual leadership component, the only two things they actually manage is confidence and capacity.
Yes. Tell me
Tell me.
more.
No,
Yeah, tell me
I
more.
was going to
No,
say
you.
that to you. That's not fair.
Well, so when you say confidence and capacity, how are you define? I mean, um, confidence and say it again.
Confidence and capacity.
And
So
capacity,
confidence in their organization, confidence in their leadership,
right?
confidence in their people,
Right.
confidence throughout the organization. That if an organization doesn't feel confident, then it's clearly not gonna do things.
Yes.
And yet that seems so woolly and
It does.
touchy-feely
Like
that
because it's that when we talk about leadership is inspiring,
right.
I think that's getting at confidence,
Uh-huh.
because if they are inspiring people, what they are demonstrating is I'm confident. I'm confident in you. I'm confident in your capabilities, and you're the people who are going to take this organization where we need it to go. And that it feels woolly, but it's really not, because if
Not.
I am confident, my ability to translate that in my communication is exactly what we mean when we say be inspiring.
I agree completely. And what's amazing to me is that having that confidence begets more confidence. And so, but I think confidence is really you have confidence in your people, confidence in your ability, confidence in your team, confidence in your leadership group, which always puts you in a position where probably two things happen right away. One is you'll increase diversity of information because you're confident. So nothing frightens you.
Right.
More information is better. More information from different places in the organization is better. You
Right.
know, everything's just data. And so you want as much as you can. And secondly, and I think that this is the big one, is that you also realize that you don't know. And not knowing as a leader is at least in my observation, is a way sexier place than knowing, because not knowing actually allows you the ability to understand your organization better because you're learning.
Yes. Yeah, the learning thing, right? Is the best leaders are the best learners, and they're not afraid of that. They're not afraid of not knowing the answer. They're not afraid of asking the dumb questions, right?
Right.
And the heroic leader is kind of not a thing anymore, because business is just so complex that, and it works at such a clip. The changes, the environment is such that they've got to work together, right? Leadership teams put you in a place of not knowing, and more brains are better. And if
Yeah.
you're really doing the collab with your leadership team, right?
Yeah.
That's the power, and to feel safe in that not knowing. And the only way to make better decisions is to have all the perspectives.
Yeah. To have more perspectives, right?
Yeah.
Which takes us to your question. The final part of that is the capacity. And I
Yes.
look at capacity as having the space to do what you need to do. And by space, I'm using it kind of metaphorically. I have the money, I have the skills, I have the right people, I have the right resources, I have the right approvals, I have the right confidence, I have the right faith in my people. They have faith in me. And so that capacity, I always think about capacity as kind of a margin. But so one interesting thing that's going on right now, and there's quite a bit of interesting stuff going on right now, is the astronauts that are trapped on this space station or whatever it's called, the USS or the Skylab thing, but it's not called
Yeah.
the space station, right?
Yeah. Right.
So that seems really frightening and scary, except that they have so much extra food. They have the ability to generate their own oxygen.
Right.
They can have other crafts from other countries get there, and they're not in a hurry. So if it doesn't work this time, wait one more orbit around the Earth and maybe it'll work next time.
Yeah.
That's capacity. Capacity is this extensibility, or David Woods calls it graceful extensibility, which I actually really like that image. Graceful
Yeah.
extensibility for an organization to flex, adapt, improvise, problem solve. And so the idea that we're constantly building capacity is really it's really important, but it runs counterthetical to our traditional view of organizations. And the best example, actually, so does confidence. That's counterthetical. That's against, but the best example I can think of how this runs opposite of what we think it runs is capacity is not something you can measure, but you can monitor.
Talk about that. Talk about
Well,
that. Because, when you're working with leaders, right? A lot
yeah,
of it is we can talk about capacity, and that's a great idea. Because, I'm always talking about capacity in the individual, right? How do you build capacity in a person as you're leading that person? How do you give them a workout such that they can expand themselves in ways they didn't think they could.
Right.
Right.
Which is capacity. That's a beautiful definition of capacity.
Yes. And
Voila.
so, but when you get to this resource constrained mindset, when you get to this place where they are feeling, and you said something, and I totally got off track in my brain. But the when it's when you say counterthetical, how did that this defeats their ability to really engage with it at some level? And so
Yeah.
that's where I'm kind of curious is what's the hook?
Well,
How
so part of it is and this is really inside baseball, but part of it is the difference between a linear organization and a non-linear organization. So a strong organization that's filled with engineers,
Mhm.
right? Like let's make one up, a shipyard or a airplane factory, or I mean, we
A
could,
tractor factory,
yeah,
yeah.
refinery, right? There's a
Mhm.
bazillions of them. They want to believe that their organization is a linear functioning thing. That step one happens, then step two happens, then step three happens, and step four happens, and evermore shall be so. And if
Mhm.
we do a good enough wire diagram, we can fully understand how this organization functions. The problem is that organizations are non-linear, much more adaptive. And so they're much more on the complex side of the house, the non-linear side of the house. And so now all the tools we use to understand linear systems, metrics, right? Clear wire diagrams, simplification,
Yeah,
those tools, which are beautiful if you're fixing an engine. I mean, they're
mhm.
beautiful. They're beautiful if you're inventing a new, I don't know, printer or something. You know, they're vital for that. Don't apply in a more complex world. And so now you have leaders who oftentimes find themselves in leadership positions because they're very good at the technical aspects of the work, which is important, but they're now put into a system that doesn't behave like a technical system behaves. So it's a non-linear system. So all their tools become really, really less than optimal, which is the
Right.
big thing. So you've heard it said a million times, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Well, so that's really, really a comfortable thing to say,
Yeah.
because then it says we need to seek the perfect metric. And when we find that perfect metric, then our management problems go away. The problem is it's not a very realistic thing to say, because lots of what we do, we manage, but it's really difficult to measure.
Right. You
And
can't measure capacity.
capacity kind of fits into that category. So you have an organization that's got a lot of potential capacity in problem solving. So you're not using all your problem solving tools all the time in your organization. At least I hope not, because that would be a
It'd be
sucky place.
exhausting.
Yeah, it would be so awful to work there. Right. So you always have excess capacity that you can expand as needed. So there's like a little resource pool of capacity to problem solve that's just waiting for problems. Well, every day you wake up, you should thank God that's there, because every day some of that is used and you as a leader don't even know it, because workers are constantly detecting and correcting and fixing problems in real time. They don't even know our problems. That's
Right.
what I think about when I think about capacity. Is your system so lean and so brittle that any kind of variability causes it to snap?
Mm.
Because that's a system without enough capacity. That's a non-resilient system. And when it fails from zero to icky immediately.
Immediately.
And a system that fails without margin, that fails without capacity, always is going to fail. Not always, but oftentimes, at least in my experience, always, but oftentimes fails catastrophically. So that's why I talk about, like, if somebody dies at work, they didn't die because the company failed to prevent the accident. They died because when the accident happened, there was no capacity between the accident and the consequence. It went
Mm.
immediately to dead guy.
Yeah.
There was no little safe space. There was no recoverability. And so you think about that, and that's when you start introducing ideas like safe to fail, right? And more leaders kind of get, at least in my experience, you'd be better at this because you talk to way more, but leaders kind of understand the safe to fail idea
Hmm.
when they're talking about it kind of in the bigger world. it's harder to understand when they're talking about it in their little kingdom, phylum, genus, species.
Well, and I think it makes them nervous. I
Yeah, of
think
course.
that because the cortisol related to failure, the ego related to failure, the implications of what failure really might embody, um, they don't want to go there, and they don't
And
believe it's really safe to fail.
which is true. And in a resource constrained environment, which pretty much most leaders are in, that's kind of a normal place to be. They're constantly sort of cleaving out the excess capacity in order to create um,
Efficiency,
savings.
yeah,
Yeah, right. And
cost
so
effectiveness, yeah.
yeah, so they can say, well, we don't really need three engineers here because two will do. So they get rid of the third engineer, and now they've lost that little additional pool of problem solving that they had that they didn't even realize they had because it's hard to know when it's being used. I mean, that's the one thing I think that the pandemic did to many companies is, senior leaders were genuinely surprised that without the leadership team, the organization functioned and they delivered. Toilet paper was delivered,
Mm-hmm.
M&Ms were created, right?
Yep.
What they don't realize is that capacity was always there.
Yeah.
It's and was always being used. It just never had a chance to be seen by the head shit.
Yeah. So when you introduce this idea of right, leading capacity and leading confidence,
Mhm.
and they're going to inevitably say, how do we know we're getting capacity?
Well, so that's where the old adage, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, loses its power. You can monitor capacity like you monitor a gas gauge.
Mm-hmm.
So do we have enough capacity? No, we do not. I mean, this is sort of change. Like my work, it's really changed because we used to go out and tell people to identify risk. This is you do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Look in the organization and find the places where risk is highest. Well, so that's a pretty important question, and I think it has value. What's weird is I'm realizing now that the better question is go out into your organization and identify where capacity is low. So don't look where risk is high. Although when I say that, you probably should look where risk is high. I don't mean that.
Don't
That's
ignore
more,
that.
yeah, that's more hyperbole than actual advice.
Yeah.
But actually, what's much more interesting and what's much more important is where capacity is low. Because wherever capacity is low, then you can pretty much guarantee that's going to cost you money. It's either going to cost you an efficiency, time, you're going to have an accident, a quality
Mm-hmm.
defect, you're going to miss a deadline, you're going to overspend. I mean, and so instead of saying we failed or we cost more money, which I guess is failure in our world, we cost more money in this project because the risk was high. I think what you have to say is no, the risk is probably the risk. I
Yeah.
mean, it's pretty dynamic. It changes all the time. It's pretty normal. The reason you weren't ready is not because the risk is high. It's because your capacity was low. So that's
Yes.
a much different way to manage the world. But when you look at companies that are super good at this,
Yes.
they're super good at it. Like I was working with an airline. I'm not supposed to, I'm not going to say the name because that'd get me in trouble. But one of the senior leaders said, well, we count on the warrior spirit. And I said,
Okay.
well, I don't
What is
understand. Well, yeah, what is
please
that?
please sign me up for that. What is
Yeah,
that?
because I mean, I don't even know what that means.
Yeah.
What I think he was saying to me was they count on the additional capacity within their people
Mm.
to actually make up for the shortcomings of the organizational design or the organizational structure or the leadership capability. Those kind of things are always in question. I mean, there's always going to be poorly designed organizations and
Yeah.
crappy run projects. That's
100%.
normal. So
That
what
is
they
normal.
count on then is the excess capacity, and they're leveraging that excess capacity to create, in this case, market success.
Right? So when does leveraging capacity become burnout?
Oh, I think soon. I also think if you don't monitor that, and if you're not aware that's happening, then you're in for a big surprise. Because at some
Mhm.
point, employees are going to say, you know what, I'm not staying late tonight. I've stayed late the last 6 nights. I'm doing my work plus I'm doing additional work because we don't have enough people to do this work, and my kids got volleyball,
Yeah.
and so then it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that goes back to the diversity of information and sort of the confidence. And I mean, all those things. Because if the worker has confidence in the organization, then the worker can say, we don't have enough people to do this work.
Yeah.
So,
They're
but I
at
think leadership
capacity.
has to go out and ask, not where risk is high, where can we lose money next? That's I mean, that's a pretty self-serving question.
Right.
What we ought to be asking is, where do we have the least flexibility? Where do we have the least room for variation or mistake or bubble or blip or whatever word you want to use? Because that, I think that's a pretty cool way to look at it.
Yeah. Do you feel like you have this conversation with leaders, you come in and they go, aha, and they're like, yes, this makes sense to me, right? So I spent a lot of time, I don't know if you're familiar with the Kinevin framework, are you?
I am. I'm not a fan. Should I be?
Well, I think it's a really great way for people to understand, um, especially engineers, to understand that um, it's a sense making right diagram. It's a sense
Well,
making model that's there to help you understand what kind of problem are you looking at? What is the situation you're facing? And once you identify that, understand there's a different way to approach it. And so when we talk about complex adaptive systems, right?
mhm,
Your approach to that is experimental, right? You sense and you experiment, right? Versus if it's a complicated system, which is the mechanical, we've
right.
got the wireframe dialogue, right? That is an expert. That is who knows how to do this, and it's good practice. And let's bring in the expert, and let's analyze, and let's fix it. And so, what I think it helps people leaders to understand, teaching it from a leadership context, is that if you're not standing out of your problem to understand that you can't, if you keep approaching your organization from a complicated perspective and putting in experts, right? Bringing in the McKinsey's, bringing in the whoever,
Yeah. I mean,
right?
McKinsey comes to mind. Yeah. Look, there's a bunch
And
of 23-year-olds in here.
there's a bunch of 23 girls with a lot of experience that have
Yeah.
some databases who can tell us what the recipe is. And if you keep applying that solution to a complex adaptive system, and stop wondering why it doesn't work, because you're not even taking the appropriate approach. And I think that's what the framework helps you understand is, how do I approach this to begin with? Because if I'm not even thinking about that, I'm going to default to what I prefer.
Right. Well, but that's so yeah, absolutely. But
Yeah.
it's not what you prefer. It's kind of how it's your frame. It's how you see the world.
Well,
Right. So
yeah, but
so you're gonna have
what you're
you're
accustomed to, right?
yeah, you're gonna have a bias. And the challenge I have
Right.
is that we hire people into these jobs because of this bias,
Hmm.
but then we expect that bias to be changeable, and it's not changeable. So I maybe I can fall in love with this cartoon, the Kinevin framework. I just need to spend more time on it. I
Yeah.
do think it's much more of an input problem than an output problem.
Input
So
problem.
I
Say
well,
more.
so if I see a senior leadership team that's really struggling, I almost immediately assume, and normally this works out pretty well, that it's not the leadership team, it's the data that's being fed to the leadership team. So I might be super naive because I'm pretty naive on stuff, but I kind of figure if you give the leaders good information, they'll make pretty good decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And what
I
we
mean,
know is the higher they push the information up,
yeah,
the more
and
modified and
and
palatable that information becomes.
and well, and the less, I mean, it becomes important that we don't oversimplify. So the biggest, I think, one of the biggest problems we have with leadership
Mm,
is that we simplify information before we push it up.
right.
So we have this really context barren information that goes up to the senior leaders desk because they're so damn important. You can have 3 minutes with Jerry's going to give you 3 minutes. So if you give me 3 minutes, then all you're going to get is a 3-minute
Right.
solution. I
Right.
mean, if this is a problem, it's a problem. And I promise you, when someone dies or a plant blows up or whatever bad thing happens,
Yeah.
you'll give me all the time you have. I mean, you'll stay late and come in early.
Right.
So the challenge I think we have, and when I managed all these database administrators and these developers, these DevOps people, because I had to do that for a while in my career, they really taught me a big lesson. And that was that if you're having difficulty developing a piece of software to solve a problem, you don't have a good definition of what the problem is. It's not the software developers, it's not the development process, it's the definition of the problem. It's bad
Right.
input.
Right.
And so one of the things I've really had to learn is that if I see a team struggling, the first thing I do is try to change the input, change the data they're being given. And I'll ask them to go out and ask entirely different questions.
Yeah.
And they'll say, well, what do you want me to ask? And I'll say, what do you ask now? And they'll tell me, and I say, opposite of that.
Yeah.
You're smart, figure it out. But whatever you're asking now, that's giving you this input.
Right.
If you want different input, ask different questions. And
Right.
all this crap, this is the problem is it sounds so easy, but that's actually a big deal.
Well, it is a big deal and it's really, really hard. And I found a lot of these leaders struggle with they want to execute, they want to do, they want
Yeah, yeah,
action, they want to move the needles, they want to, but they don't spend the time to really ask the hard questions of
right.
what is the
Well,
problem I'm trying to solve.
it's almost worse too because I can point you to leaders. I can actually show you one that has a sign that says, "Don't bring me a problem, bring me a solution." Okay, so
Mm.
that must feel really like you're a super guy, and that man, how can you walk with that much, um, equipment? You know what I mean? I put the quotes.
Yeah.
Wow, other men must want to be you. That kind of, but you realize that that is perhaps one of the dumber things a leader can say
Yeah.
because the solution's the least interesting part of the problem. And in fact, not knowing the problem means you're probably going to fix the wrong thing pretty aggressively.
Pretty
And the worst
aggressively.
people to solve the problem are the people who lead the people who have the problem. It's always the case. I mean, they're terrible at it. So,
Right. They can't see it. They can't see it enough. And we've tried this, we've done this,
yeah,
and
we've done everything.
we know all the reasons of why. And yeah, you
Here's
don't
how to fix
understand.
this. Yeah.
Yes.
What do you think about when you think about capacity like that?
Well, it's just this weird kind of, it's almost poetry in a way because it lives in so many things. Leadership of, do you have the capacity? Are you creating enough capacity in your own mind to stand out of things, right? Do you create capacity to think through as opposed to just make decisions, right? And I think when you get people who are newer into a leadership role and have been in an execution, that standing out of something and thinking through something doesn't feel like work. It doesn't feel like anything's moving forward.
Yeah.
And when it comes to working a problem and so managing capacity, which is really about what is the problem we're trying to solve and how are we going about it, that it asks for time and it asks for space and it sometimes asks for other perspectives that you wouldn't think to go get, because time is money and we need to move the needle.
So how do you I completely agree with what you just said. And what I often think is it's way sexier to fix a problem than it is to analyze a problem. So how do
Right.
you get them to fall in love with the analysis? And it should be, by all rights, that should be easy because most of these people are engineers, they're highly technical. They totally vibe on, if you get into the dirt, they love it. But
Yeah.
for some reason on the leadership level,
They don't want to do it.
yeah, somebody's told them that you don't have time for that.
And I
Cut,
think
cut
that's a
to the
huge
chase. Cut,
mistake.
cut to the
Yeah.
chase.
I'm the guy who gets the slide with the 3 bullet points,
Yeah.
right? I'm not the one who needs to have capacity. Y'all need capacity.
Yeah.
I'm
That's
just
it. I think you actually might have just solved the problem. But that's the case is that leadership capacity. And that's why, like in the five principles, I talk a lot about how leaders respond. And when that first came out, a bunch of these lily-hearted snowflakes,
Hmm.
I don't want to say their names, but I can see them in my head,
Yeah.
changed it and said, no, everybody but how everybody responds matters. And I
No.
said, no, that's complete bullshit.
Yeah.
Um, no, no, that's not it. It's how leaders respond matters.
Right.
And if you take away the leader part, then you just have some kind of platitude that's just like, well, we should be nice to everybody. Well, yeah, we should. But
Yeah.
specifically, the onus for change is not on the people who
Right.
work in the organization. It's on the leaders who lead the organization. And so how
Right.
they respond makes a huge difference.
Yeah. It does. And I added to the end of your hot principles, my favorite sentences as I taught them, this is it, no one's coming. You're
Isn't that
it.
funny?
You are the leader and no
Yeah.
one's coming to help you.
Yeah.
And so you have to have the capacity, because if
Yeah.
you don't, you can hardly lead it, let alone manage it in anybody else.
You're exactly right. That's your next book.
This is it. No one's
Seriously.
coming.
No, that's your next book. This is it. No one's coming.
This is it. Well,
That's
because
a
I think
that's a really, really good idea for a book.
it's because when you are in a change, when you are in an innovation, when you are in even turning around, doing safety differently, right? You are asking people to engage at a different level. And if you think it's just them who has to do it, if you haven't done your own work first, if you haven't
Yeah.
gotten your own capacity
Yeah.
under clarity for yourself, there's no way you're going to be able to bring that to anybody else.
Amen. You're exactly right. And that's the crazy thing. That's why safety is a pretty good Trojan horse.
Mm-hmm.
It's important. There's no question that it's not important. But what we're really talking about is exactly what you talk about, which is leadership. So if we
Mm-hmm.
want a better organization, we need to have better leadership. I mean, that's that seems like those
Hands
are
down.
directly connected to one another.
Yes. So I mean, and I think that's the challenge. And that's, my interest in sort of when you are done talking to these leaders, what's the when somebody gets let out of jail and they go back, what is that? Recidivism? What's the
Yeah.
recidivism rate?
So progress is weird. Progress ebbs and flows, and there will always be. So I'm 100% convinced you're always one new senior leader away from starting again. So
Right.
as soon as they change the top guy or gal, it's all gonna you're starting again.
Well, and
But
almost if you have one change on the leadership team and that
yeah,
person's got enough input into
power.
the
Yeah, yeah,
power, they'll change the whole thing. Yeah.
yeah, and they will. The good news is that I think it's an incremental change, and the best way to observe the change is you can really observe it in the language they use,
Mm,
because they start using language that's more focused towards curiosity. They
yes.
become much more interested in what, not who. The one
Mhm.
I listen for, and this comes from Edgar Schein, is they become much more interested in how, not why.
Right.
And that's
The
and good
conversation
leader,
changes. Yeah.
yeah, totally. And good leaders hardly ever ask why.
Yeah.
It's weird they ask how. Even
How'd that
though
happen? Yeah.
What's that guy's name? Simon Sinek,
Simon Sinek. Yeah.
who wrote Getting to Why, or You Have to Ask
Yes.
Why. He's made his fortune on why, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Because people do business with you because of your why.
Yeah. Well,
I have
so
his book somewhere.
the
Yeah.
bottom line is that what Shine would have told you is that why's interesting, but not nearly as interesting as how. And it's funny when you think about the difference between how and why, they're pretty different.
They're
Why
incredibly
did
different,
why did you
right?
hit your brother versus how did you hit your brother? I mean,
Yeah.
that's
Well, which in accountability is the same thing, right? When you
yeah,
go to context, it's all about the how, right?
yeah,
How are you thinking about it? Well, what was going on in your brain when you made the decision to do that or not do that, right?
yeah.
How did that impact?
And so that gets kind of hardwired. And I do think we're seeing, I'm probably naive, but I do think we're seeing a change in that. But I think the world's changing. I mean, it's definitely employment is changing. And then just there's just this whole weird, I don't know, this weird authoritarian push that's happening kind of globally.
Hmm.
It's really bizarre that I don't get it, but it doesn't seem to be very closely reflected in organizations. So one thing that I think is super interesting is that organizations are getting healthier and governments are getting less healthy.
Yes.
And I don't know what that
Yes.
means, but I bet it means something.
I bet it does mean something. And I'm very curious to see how that plays out because I have the same sensibility. I'm like, why is government turning, I feel like, the Weimar Republic. It's like, what's happening?
Yeah.
How is this
How's it
going in
going?
this direction? Yeah.
And it's
And
global. I mean,
yeah,
it's
we're not the
this
only
is
ones.
yeah. I mean, it's all over Europe. It's it's global.
But I do feel like the conversation changes. And so when we look at what to measure, right?
Hmm.
Those are the leading indicators.
Right.
And those
And
are
that
the more meaningful indicators
because I think
of
it's a
shift.
snapshot. Yeah, exactly. It's a snapshot into how what you're really looking at. What it's a leading indicator to is that those are the evidence that we're given that they're thinking differently about the problem.
Right. Because how you talk
So
about it is how you show up in it.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's definitely how you're categorizing it in your head and how you're conceptualizing it. If you are a big believer in kind of the Worf-Sapir hypothesis, which says that um, language controls thought, thought
Mm-hmm.
does not control language, language controls thought, then
Mm-hmm.
those are pretty good indicators. That's
Yeah.
also another podcast, but
Exactly. But so I mean that's so when you look at are we doing capacity? Are we really creating it? Is it happening? Are you talking differently? Are your conversations
right.
changing? Is the
Are you,
first question.
yeah, are you asking different questions? Are you monitoring different things?
Yeah.
And they really have to go. And what's funny is that most leaders, because they're so desperate to know what to do, tell me
Yeah.
what to do, I'll do it. Tell me what to do. Just what's
Yeah.
the answer? Or the one they ask all the time is, what do other organizations who are very successful at this do? Right.
That's
Well, that's a cheesy way to say, tell me what
she's
to
would
do.
tell me what to do. Yeah.
Yeah. But generally, if you can get them to sort of become interested in larger data sets, more diverse data sets, small d diversity, um, you just get better leadership. The best leaders, what would you say earlier? Leadership is learning.
Yeah, the best leaders are the best
Learning.
learners. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the best leaders are super curious about their organization. So
Yeah.
they're super curious. They're really interested in what's happening when nothing bad's happening.
Yeah, that whole like, let's think about it. Let's look at what we're thinking about and having the conversation as opposed to answering the mail, answering the
Yeah.
questions all the time, being the source. Um, and instead of being
Yeah.
the source of the questions as opposed to the source of the answers,
Yep. Exactly.
which, is super satisfying because it's a very circular conversation in the way that it's easier than you think and harder than you think at the same time. Because you're not listening hard enough, first of all, because you can't tell if anybody's having a different conversation because you're so busy being in a conversation.
Right.
And I think that's the nuance of it. And when leaders slide back into the fray of the culture, they don't stand out of the meeting long enough at a distance. They don't distance themselves to really hear. They don't distance themselves to really observe
Yeah.
and pay attention at the level they need to pay attention to see if capacity is actually being addressed.
And they can do some things like they can change their tools. So
Mm-hmm.
they can change the form they give to people to present to the board of directors, or they can get rid of the give me 3 bullet points, and
Mm-hmm.
replace it with give me a narrative 1 page long that tells the story of how we got to where we got to.
Mm-hmm.
And stories have a beginning, middle, and end. So it needs to have a beginning, middle, and end. It needs to be narrative by nature. I should be able to read it on the
Yeah.
toilet.
Right. And enjoy the whole arc.
That's right. The entire arc, the toilet arc.
Oh, well, this has been very, very insightful.
The
Thank
pleasure's
you.
been mine. Thank you.
I appreciate having this conversation because I do think that there's so much to the hop relative to all the things leadership, all the things innovation, and not just safety. And
I
so
agree. I
I am
completely agree with you.
I am taking you to town on all my clients. It's all
And I'm
good.
certainly glad you're jumping on, man.
Yeah.
Such a perfect fit for you. I'm surprised
It
it took us so long, really.
I know. Like you've been doing this for how long? And then it was like, what?
I don't know. Like you said,
Uh,
because you don't. I don't know. I don't think about it that way for some weird reason. I don't know why.
Yeah. Well, I don't think about what you do. I just think, oh, Todd.
It's just work. It's just,
Yeah,
I just
it's
does,
just work.
yes.
Yeah, it's just the whole work thing he does.
It's not
Yeah.
even that. Yeah, just work. That's what they do. So
Awesome.
will millions of people hear this? Are we going to be famous?
Well, I don't know about millions, but there'll be a few. Maybe it'll change. Maybe it'll change a few critical people that need to know, and I will feel better for that.
And then it's worth it.
That's
I
right.
kind of agree.
That's right.
Thank you so much for listening. You can check out Sandy's website at satoriconsultinginc.ca. That's SATORI consultinginc.ca. And visit Jen's website at own-up.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.